Oral questions by members.
Leader of the Official Opposition.
Yesterday, Mr. Speaker, we saw this facility, the Legislative Precinct, effectively blockaded and obstructed for about 6 hours. This is not the first time we've had public infrastructure blockaded, and in recent memory we have the Schwartz Bay Terminal, which was shut down on January 20th of this year, the CN Rail link near New Hazelton from February 8th to 12th, and we all know the risk of fatalities in rail lines. Delta Port and Port of Vancouver, February 8th to 9th. The Johnson Street Bridge and the Bay Street Bridge, February 10th. Vancouver's Cambie and Broadway intersection on February 11th for, I gather, 14 hours. And then, of course, today we have the Granville Street Bridge blocked in both directions on the main route between VGH and St. Paul's. So the question obviously comes up, how much longer will the Premier tolerate this obstruction of essential infrastructure that not only inconveniences people, but puts people's lives at risk and makes life miserable for ordinary British Columbians?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the Leader of the Opposition for his question. Clearly, with respect to events here yesterday, I don't think there's a member of this House that was not disoriented and disrupted in our activities here. I give full credit to the staff, as the Leader of the Opposition did, in keeping our legislative precinct operating. We delivered a throne speech that had a whole host of issues that give hope to British Columbians in every corner of this province with respect to their car insurance, with respect to continuing education for their youth, and a whole host of other issues that we will be able to talk about in the throne speech debate and beyond. With respect to the disruptions that the civil disobedience is leading to, I agree with the minister, or pardon me, the former minister, and I want to acknowledge to all members of the House and to all British Columbians that civil unrest is an appropriate part of our discourse in British Columbia and in Canada. But interfering in the livelihoods and the well-being of other people, putting other people at risk, is not acceptable. Every member of this House agrees with that statement. We need to ensure that law enforcement has the tools they need. That's through the courts. It is not through edicts from politicians. We need to respect those issues that have kept this country vibrant and dynamic for 150 plus years, and I'm confident that all members agree with that.
Leader of the Official Opposition on a supplemental.
Well, there's no dispute in this House and in our society that peaceful, orderly dissent is part of our democracy. That's what the front lawn of the legislature was designed and built for, and that's why it remains an open space through thick and thin. But British Columbians have limits on the right of protest. Closing the container terminal at Prince Rupert costs $100,000 a day in lost wages alone, let alone lost commerce and lost credibility. Closing the Cambie and Broadway intersection for 14 hours on the busiest ambulance route in Western Canada means that people with chest pain on their way to get life-saving procedures go on a detour with a motorcycle escort because somebody decided to light a fire in the middle of the intersection. The leader of the federal NDP has tweeted, "The RCMP need to stand down." Will the Premier stand here today and condemn the remarks from the federal leader of the NDP?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate those on the other side of the House have multiple leaders in Ottawa, but certainly Mr. Singh is entitled to his opinions, as are all British Columbians and indeed all Canadians. I will agree with the member, and I know this will be disorienting for him, I agree with the member that we need to address the challenges that the disruptions in activities in British Columbia have resulted from the dispute on the land of the Wet'suwet'en people in northern British Columbia. But we all know that the people that were assembled here yesterday were talking about a whole bunch of issues completely disassociated with the Wet'suwet'en people and a host of other issues. This is a challenge for all of us, government, opposition, regular citizens. But we do not want to live in a society where politicians direct law enforcement to do issues that are outside the bounds of their abilities within the confines of our judicial system Seek an injunction, that's what companies do. That's what we have been doing, not just for the past month, but for 150 years.
Leader of the Official Opposition on a second supplemental.
Well, since the Leader of the Government of British Columbia is not prepared to dismiss the remarks from his federal counterpart who seems to think the police should stay out of the way, let's try another one. It's no secret that the NDP have encouraged and supported protesters and illegal blockades in the past. The now Minister of Forests, who sits behind the Premier, has said, quote, "In the Wet'suwet'en governance system, the rightful Aboriginal title holders are the hereditary chiefs," end quote. A year ago, that minister visited the illegal camp to show his government's continued support for the hereditary chiefs, who were at the time obstructing permits and have recently been blocking a court-ordered injunction. The Parliamentary Secretary for Emergency Preparedness said, quote, "The elected band council system is a colonial construct," end quote. So, Premier, it's time to rise and make clear that the rule of law, as created by this institution, is the law of British Columbia, and that the role of the government of the day is to enforce the law. So will the Premier stand here today and disavow the remarks from his Minister of Forests and his Parliamentary Secretary and stand by the rule of law?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, I appreciate that out of context comments or the stock and trade of opposition parties, but this is an extremely serious issue and all of us understand that. And I think it's important that we hold it in that place and talk about these things in an open way. All of us unanimously supported the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples just last fall. And those words need to mean something beyond just being on a piece of paper. That means honest, genuine dialogue with the different views in our province. Leadership is not about directing people to get out of the way if we disagree with them. Leadership is about bringing people together to find a way forward. That's what we're all about on this side of the house.
Member Richmond, Queensborough.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2015, the now Minister of Forests said, and I quote, "In the Wet'suwet'en governance system, the rightful Aboriginal title holders are the hereditary chiefs. No hereditary chiefs have said yes to pipelines in their territories. In fact, they've said no to LNG-related gas pipelines across their traditional territories," end quote. Will the minister stand in this House and admit he was wrong and reject his past comments? Will the minister admit his actions inflamed the situation and ultimately encouraged unlawful behaviour?
Premier.
Honourable Speaker, all of us here have dual roles. Those on this side of the House, a portion of us are in government. We're part of Executive Council. Every member of this House is accountable and responsible to their constituents. The member for Stikine was visiting his constituents and they were conducting lawful activity. When that stopped, he stopped meeting with them. I think it's beyond the pale, honourable members, to bring up acting on behalf of your constituents as part and parcel of what has been not a recent phenomenon, but a 150-year-old challenge about addressing the injustice to Indigenous peoples right across this province. That's what we all collectively agreed to do last fall. Let's redouble our efforts to come together to find a way forward, each of us at the same time, all members of this House, making a better British Columbia.
Richmond, Queensborough on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's important to note, of course, the Minister of Forests was minister at that time when he visited that site, number one. It's also important to note on the record that 20 First Nations elected bands have supported this pipeline. It's also important to note that there's going to be $1 billion worth of construction work available to First Nations and non-First Nations communities. The problem with the NDP, Mr. Speaker, is they want to have it both ways. In opposition, they routinely participated in protests against the Coastal GasLink pipeline and vowed to stop the project. This week, the friend and predecessor of the Minister of Advanced Education chimed in. She is presently the NDP MP for Vancouver East. She had this to say, quote, "As arrests continue, there are uprisings all across the country. People from all four directions are rallying in support of the Wet'suwet'en, shutting down roads, rail lines, ports, and trains," end quote. Will the minister admit today these statements are wrong and that they've encouraged unlawful protest?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And again, I'm grateful for the question from the member from the opposition. And I'll remind him that we put in place a framework so that the LNG Canada project would proceed in British Columbia, the largest private sector investment in Canadian history. We did that. We did that conscious that not every British Columbian agreed with us. We did that knowing that there was a divide in communities, not just in the north, but in the south as well. And this is the teachable moment. This is the teachable moment for people on that side of the House. Life is not black and white. Life is complex, and you have to work with people to get positive outcomes. That's why they're over there, and that's why we're over here.
Leader, third party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We indeed have seen escalating protests across the province and across the country as people are rallying in response to the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who have, as has been pointed out, opposed the Coastal GasLink pipeline. At its core, though, and what's not being said in the previous questions, is that these protests represent the long-standing failure of Canadian governments to properly adhere to Supreme Court decisions that establish the need to address and reconcile Aboriginal rights and title with the Crown sovereignty. The issues that the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs have raised are not new. Government has been well aware of the existing, long-standing and unresolved matters relating to rights and title in the area. And yet, in spite of this, the NDP prioritized the financial regime, putting it in place to get LNG Canada, knowing full well that there was work to be done in the Wet'suwet'en territory. My question is to the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. Why did the government proceed with approving a fiscal package for LNG Canada when they knew these outstanding matters, legacy issues over 30 years, with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, had not yet been resolved?
Minister, Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member, the leader of the third party, for his question. This project represents a significant opportunity for all people in British Columbia, Honourable Speaker. 3,000 people so far have been hired on the project. Local and Indigenous businesses are benefiting from this project, and the project will generate, it's estimated, $23 billion in revenue to the people of British Columbia for the services that we all use and care about. BC did conduct extensive consultations with Indigenous nations and has been and has signed with the vast majority of those nations has signed agreements along the pipeline route. Substantial efforts also have been made to consult and accommodate concerns that have been raised. And I should also note that we've been engaging in meaningful discussions, government-to-government, nation-to-nation discussions, reconciliation discussions with the Office of the Wet'suwet'en, that is the hereditary chiefs, Honourable Speaker. Our discussions are proceeding in a respectful way, with recognition that this work together is both complex and will take time. But this work is continuing, Honourable Speaker, and we will continue to work closely with the Office of Wet'suwet'en, the hereditary chiefs.
Leader, third party on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of my proudest moments as an MLA was the passage of the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act, DRIPA as it's known. One of my hardest days was being escorted into this place by police to get past protesters screaming that reconciliation is dead, Mr. Speaker. I've worked with the Minister for over 2 years to bring us to the introduction and the passage of DRIPA this past fall. When this House passed DRIPA unanimously, we all took responsibility for recognizing that Indigenous law is within the Canadian legal system, while also expressly recognizing that leadership other than established by the Federal Indian Act exists. I will never accept that reconciliation is dead. In fact, now is when we must lean in. However, it is more important than ever that this government, through their words and more importantly their actions, shows a pathway forward. My question again to the Minister of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation. What are the immediate steps he is taking to initiate a more positive dialogue and set in motion the action plans required to truly engage in the work that this government committed to in advancing reconciliation?
Minister, Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
Again, thank you, Honourable Speaker, and thanks to the member for the question. The Leader of the Third Party, also, I want to thank him for his advice and his insight for the last 2.5 years on the work we've been doing in the Ministry of Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation around a whole range of initiatives regarding reconciliation. I want to thank him for that. While the events of the past week underscore, I think, the challenges that we all face in reconciliation, they in no way shake our resolve as government, or I would hope for all of us in this place, to advance reconciliation. BC is the leader in advancing reconciliation. We made history by recognizing the human rights of Indigenous people in law in this place just a few months ago. The process of aligning BC laws to the UN Declaration will take time, but that work is already underway, Honourable Speaker. The next step is developing an action plan in collaboration with Indigenous peoples, which will set out the priorities and the timeline and the accountabilities. We have begun discussions with Indigenous partners on how best to involve Indigenous peoples in the development of the action plan. And in addition, all ministers are continuing to their ongoing work to look at their legislation within their ministries to bring them into alignment with the UN Declaration. But there's a lot more to do, and reconciliation is a top priority for this government, regardless of the events of this last week. I would just remind everyone in this House the $50 million towards Indigenous language revitalization, the sharing of revenue, the largest revenue sharing agreement in the history of this province, $3 billion over 25 years, long-term stable funding that never existed before for every First Nations community in this province, delivering affordable housing on reserve, Honourable Speaker, never done before. And of course, ensuring, Honourable Speaker, that children are cared for in Indigenous communities where that care belongs. And all of that work, it forms the basis for us as a government changing the Crown Indigenous relationship in a way that will make it better for all people in British Columbia. Thank you.
Member for Skeena.
Good grief. The politics in this place hasn't done First Nations any favors. It's politics that got us to this place. You talk about going to talk to Hereditary Chiefs, going to talk about the issues. On that same day when you went to talk to Hereditary Chiefs, did you go visit the band councils too? Did you think about all the issues First Nations are facing? The suicides, the unemployment. Did anybody talk about that? I hear these words, accountability, honest, genuine dialogue. Nobody has any business going into these First Nation communities and furthering the divide in any of the communities. You should be ashamed of yourselves. You're talking about one of the most vulnerable people in Canada. And I'm already hearing heckling. Who's heckling me? Where's that member from? Powell River Central. These are real issues. And for the first time in our history, we have the opportunity to fix these issues. But no, what do we see? We see 1% of a minority being addressed in this House. Nobody's talking about the 99% of the people that are being put into jobs, education, training, and fixing their own lives. We're hearing a lot of talk about Aboriginal rights and title here. Which case law principle are you talking about? Haida, Delgamu, Mikisew Cree, which one? There's a whole rafter of case law principles that define the relationship between the Crown and First Nations. That's the rule book we should have been following. not the political road that we're taking now. My question is to the Minister of Indigenous Relations. On January 27th, you hired Nathan Cullen to talk to Wet'suwet'en Hereditary Chiefs. Is he still working for you guys?
Minister, Indigenous Relations and Reconciliation.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, and I thank the member for the question. I don't agree with all his premises, but I respect his position. We've actually been working with the Office of Wet'suwet'en for over a year. I was honoured to attend an event, a smoke feast, which the Premier, member from Stikine, and myself attended, and it was an inclusive process where elected were present along with the hereditary chiefs. We have since then, since that time, we have initiated a reconciliation process. We have provided resources to help with that, to hopefully bring unity together within the Wet'suwet'en people. There are disagreements, obviously, between elected and hereditary on the roles of governance within the Wet'suwet'en. Our work with them is in part to help bring the communities together in ways. At that time we brought on, and he is still working with us, Murray Rankin, a respected constitutional lawyer, former MP, in the more recent process of trying to de-escalate the standoff and the police action that ended up following. We did bring in Nathan Cullen, and again, a former MP, respected person to work to help coordinate, and he co-chaired the meetings that we attended with the Office of Wet'suwet'en in our relationship building and learning the role of the hereditary and how that plays with the rest of the community. And that work will continue. It began with an invite from the Office of Wet'suwet'en to attend a very important ceremony, and we were all very honored to take part in that. And I don't make any apologies for the work we're doing on reconciliation with all Wet'suwet'en people.
Member for Skeena on a supplemental.
So the question is Nathan Cullen still working for you guys? That was the question. Didn't ask if the work was ongoing on reconciliation and whatnot. This was a specific exercise undertaken by this government. But let's just look at what Nathan Cullen has said over the years. On January 8th, quote, "For the Wet'suwet'en responsibility falls to the traditional elders, the hereditary chiefs of each of the house clans," end quote. On February 10th, quote, "If CGL proceeds before the issues of rights and title of Wet'suwet'en have been sorted, we will be throwing their rights away," end quote. You hired a guy that already has a bias against LNG and already has an opinion on what rights and titles should look like. The only people that should determine that is the courts of BC and Canada, not some ex-politician who already has made some statements. So, the question remains, is Nathan Cullen still working for you guys?
Premier.
Honourable Speaker, and I appreciate the view of the member for Skeena. Again, I want to reiterate that the objective of government, any government, all governments, is to try and find a positive way forward for all people in the jurisdiction you're responsible for. And I make no apologies for taking someone of the caliber of Nathan Cullen, well respected by Coastal GasLink, by LNG Canada, by the Office of the Wet'suwet'en, and by this government, and asking him to help us find a way forward, because that's what governing is about, finding a way forward. Your absolutes, the members' absolutes are the whole point. That's the whole reason why we're trying to unravel this, to bring the jobs that we all want in the community that he represents, to bring prosperity to all British Columbians, not just those who are lucky enough to buy in at the start. We want to make sure that First Peoples and everyone is in a position to benefit from the splendor of this province. You can shake your head all you want, member. You can shake your head all you want. You don't care about harmony. You just want disruption.
Members. Members, order, please. House Leader for the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, we've talked about what happened yesterday here at this building. We've also heard recitation of the shutdown of ports, major roadways, what's happening in downtown right now. I was also privy to an online message from someone who was literally trapped in their office building downtown and trying to go out through the stairwell, gets to the bottom, guess what, barricaded, can't go out. Very serious. But we've got something else coming up, and that is that the same group are now planning something on the 14th. I'll read from one of their organizing emails. Quote, "This coming Friday the 14th, beginning at 8 a.m. and continuing till noon, a whole bunch of us," and by their planning document, it looks like it's close to 500, "a whole bunch of us have committed to coordinating the shutdown of as many BC government ministries as we can," end quote. Will they be allowed to shut down these ministry offices?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker. And as I said in questions from the Leader of the Opposition, all of us and all British Columbians want those who have a different point of view to have the opportunity to express that point of view, but not at the expense of the liberty of other people. It's pretty straightforward, and that's a role for law enforcement and the courts. And again, I asked the member, would she like to live in a society where the Leader of the Opposition could direct police to do whatever he felt was best for him? Of course not, and we don't think that either.
House Leader for the Official Opposition on a supplemental.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What the Premier is ignoring, though, there's also another obligation, and it's not about politicians interfering in what police do or things like that. There's also proactive planning. As an employer, right? As an employer, you have people you need to keep safe. You have operations that need to continue. The protesters themselves have an extensive planning document. They identify, and I believe since it's online, I'm sure, government folks must have possession of this as well. They've targeted 20 sites. They've identified them. They've asked participants to identify where they will be involved. And, quote, they've also said, quote,
Members.
They're employees of the government. You might want to listen. It's about safety. So keep it up.
Members.
Until you see the list. What are you going to do to keep them safe?
Members, order, please.
You over there.
The House Leader for the Official Opposition has the floor. Member.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the organizing email goes on to say, quote, "Feel free to let me know if you have a particular grudge against any ministry in particular." So they're organizing on that basis. The reason I'm asking the question is not to ask that government somehow get in there and play director with the individual police operations. It's this. You actually have an obligation to plan proactively for how these workers will be kept safe, how ministry operations will go forward, and that's where my question lands. Notwithstanding the fact that we have government ministers who have lent their support to these protests in the past, people who work there and people who rely on the services want assurance that these folks will not be allowed to get close enough to shut down government services. What kind of plans are in place, and can these workers be assured that this isn't going to happen?
Premier.
Thank you, Honourable Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, which is an appropriate one, appropriately delivered. And yes, government is working on a plan to address these issues. I'm confident that the security personnel here have access to that material, but I'm confident that if you're prepared to give us a copy, we'll ensure that the appropriate authorities have them. The issue, however, is an appropriate one, and I want all members of this place and all public employees working for the province of British Columbia, there is a plan in place to protect them in the event that this type of activity continues. I think we all know and recognize the member of the Leader of the Official Opposition made reference to it in his opening question. No one wants to shut down legitimate debate and dialogue and dissent. It's unlawful activity that all of us abhor. I support the member on that. I support the House Leader on that. And I think that if we start talking in a civilized way about the challenges that the member for Skeena touched upon, about making sure we can lift people out of poverty by working together to try and make sure that everyone's on board when we move forward, not unanimity, but a better understanding understanding of what makes everybody tick, that's a good thing for government to do. We're absolutely prepared. I thank the member for a thoughtful question, and we'll proceed from there.
Member Abbotsford West.
Well, the events of yesterday were certainly extraordinary here in BC. Members of the public, public servants, media, MLAs, even ministers of the Crown were spit upon, they were assaulted, they were in some cases physically denied entry into this legislative assembly. And we now know that there are specific plans to expand just that kind of behavior elsewhere across the province by the same people that organized yesterday's behavior. We know that the police are investigating. Protecting the rule of law means enforcing the rule of law. The Crown Counsel Act authorizes the Attorney General to appoint a special prosecutor. In circumstances where members of the government in the past have professed sympathy and support for the people advocating this very position and advocating these tactics, will the Attorney General stand up and confirm that a special prosecutor has been appointed? And if not, why not?
Attorney General.
Thank you. Premier has been very clear the government has no time for people breaking the law, and we have absolute confidence in our Crown Counsel to do the job that's necessary.
The bell ends question period.